In 2006, the management consulting industry produced approximately $120 billion in global revenue. The primary value proposition of that industry, the reason organizations paid for strategy advice, was that the strategy itself was the scarce resource. Once the correct strategy was identified, execution would follow. This premise is wrong in a specific and consequential way that most management consulting firms understood privately and marketed against publicly. The evidence from organizational research on strategy implementation, the rate at which strategies that are approved, funded, and formally adopted are actually executed as designed, suggests that somewhere between 70% and 90% of strategic initiatives fail to achieve their intended outcomes. Not because the strategies were wrong, because the gap between what was decided and what was done was larger than anyone had modeled. This gap has a name in implementation research. It is called the implementation deficit, and it has been studied systematically since the 1970s. The research is consistent. Organizations systematically underestimate the friction between a strategic decision and the behavioral changes that decision requires, and systematically overestimate the degree of control that leadership has over the process through which the decision is executed. Every plan overestimates control and underestimates friction. This is not a characterization of bad plans. It is a structural feature of the planning process itself, one that arises from the specific cognitive conditions under which plans are made and the specific organizational conditions under which they are executed. The cognitive conditions under which plans are made are conditions of optimism. The plan is made by the people most committed to the plan's success. They are engaged, motivated, and working in conditions of high agency. They are making a decision, which is the highest expression of organizational control. The alternative scenarios they consider are the ones that fall within their existing mental model of how the organization works. The friction they anticipate is the friction that prior experience has made visible. The friction they don't anticipate, the friction that kills most strategic initiatives, is the friction that is invisible in the planning process because it exists at the implementation level rather than at the strategic level. A strategic decision to enter a new market appears straightforward at the level of the decision. We will enter this market with this product, through this channel, with this pricing. The friction that determines whether the strategic decision produces the strategic outcome is not at the decision level. It is at the implementation level. The sales team that needs to learn a new customer conversation. The product team that needs to understand requirements it has never worked with. The operations team that needs to build a logistics capability it doesn't currently have. The finance team that needs to model a revenue pattern it has never seen before. Each of these is a specific concrete behavioral change that the strategic decision requires from specific people who did not make the strategic decision and whose daily work must change in specific ways for the strategy to be executed as designed. The plan models the strategic decision. It doesn't model the behavioral changes because the planning process is conducted at the strategic level by people who aren't responsible for the behavioral changes, whose visibility into the specific friction those changes will encounter is limited. Have you ever been part of a strategic decision that was made confidently at the leadership level and that encountered friction in implementation that nobody in the planning process had anticipated? Friction that was completely predictable from the perspective of the people who had to execute. Leave a comment. The most consistently underestimated source of implementation friction is the one that doesn't appear in any financial model. The behavior of people who didn't make the decision and weren't asked. When a strategy requires behavioral changes from people who are not in the room where the strategy is made, those people will respond to the change request based on their own assessment of its merit, their own understanding of how it affects their work, their own history with prior change initiatives that were announced enthusiastically and abandoned 6 months later, and their own judgment about whether the people asking them to change actually understand what the change requires. None of these responses, however rational from the perspective of the person making them, appear in the strategic plan. The plan assumes the behavioral changes will be made because they have been decided. The people making the behavioral changes respond to something different, to whether the decision makes sense to them, whether they have the capability to execute it, whether they trust that the decision will be sustained, and whether the incentive structure they operate in rewards the change behavior or the prior behavior. The gap between the decision and the execution is the aggregate of all of these individual responses, most of them rational, most of them invisible to the people who made the decision, and most of them encountered only when the implementation is already underway. If the specific mechanism, the implementation gap as the product of friction that is structurally invisible to the planning process, is what makes this channel worth your time. The like is the direct signal. The cases this channel has examined are populated with specific implementation gaps that in retrospect were visible from the implementation level while being invisible at the strategic level. The JC Penney pricing strategy, the elimination of promotional pricing in favor of fair and square, permanent pricing, was decided at the leadership level by a CEO with a clear strategic rationale and strong prior experience with a different retail format. The friction at the implementation level was that the store associates who had built their customer relationships around the promotional pricing experience, who had learned to communicate value through the language of discounts and savings, were being asked to have a different conversation with customers without being given the tools, the training, or the incentive structure that the new conversation required. The Nokia platform decision to invest in multiple platform alternatives rather than committing to a single one was made at the leadership level by executives who had clear strategic reasons for maintaining optionality. The friction at the implementation level was that the engineering teams responsible for those platforms were operating in a state of uncertainty about which platform would receive the resources they needed to compete, which produced the attrition and organizational silence that the strategy's execution required them not to produce. The Sears Holdings strategy to organize the company into independently operating business units competing with each other was made at the leadership level by an investor with a clear theoretical framework for how internal competition drives efficiency. The friction at the implementation level was that the operational decisions that kept a retail chain running, coordinated marketing, unified inventory management, consistent store standards, required exactly the cross-unit collaboration that the internal competition model was designed to prevent. The practical response to the implementation gap is not better planning, though better planning helps. It is a specific addition to the strategy development process that most organizations skip. Before the strategy is finalized, require a structured review from the people who will execute it, not a presentation to them, a structured review by them. What specifically will you have to do differently? What capability do you currently have, and what capability will you need to acquire? What incentive structure currently governs your behavior, and how does it align or misalign with the behavioral change the strategy requires? What is the one thing that would have to be true for this strategy to encounter serious friction in your area? The people who can answer these questions most accurately are the people closest to the execution, the ones whose behavior the strategy most depends on. They are almost never in the strategy planning process. They are frequently consulted in the strategy communication process when the strategy has already been decided and the consultation is about how to present it. The strategy that survives the implementation review, that the execution team confirms is achievable with the resources and capabilities available under the current incentive structure, is not the same strategy that the planning team would have produced without the review. It is usually smaller, more specific, more sequenced, and more likely to actually be executed as designed. Most organizations don't do this review because it feels like slowing down the strategic process. What it is actually doing is moving the friction discovery from the implementation phase, when the strategy is already committed, funded, and publicly announced, to the planning phase, when the friction is still information rather than a crisis. The next episode looks at the specific gap between what was decided and what was actually done, a gap that is the product of the friction this episode describes, and that is almost never fully visible to the people who made the original decision. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.